Okay. Today we are going to be learning about how all of those macromolecules. Well, actually, we won't be learning about all of them, but we'll be learning about how glucose, in particular, glucose, which was from the biological macromolecule class of carbohydrates, right? So, how we get glucose to be turned into energy, which we need to do everything. So, you breathing each breath, right? Your diaphragm's a muscle. In order for it to contract to allow you to breathe, you need energy. In order for you to blink, in order for me to talk, in order for our hearts to beat, we need energy to do everything. So, where do we get that energy from? So we've looked at how we can actually break down food, right, in our digestive system into different classes of macromolecules. Well, now we're actually going to look at how we can actually take this glucose molecule and turn it into energy. And the process that we use to do that is something called cellular respiration, okay? And the energy that we talk about in the body is ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Okay. So actually, before you watch the remainder of this video, it's worth going on to YouTube and searching up ATP and respiration crash course biology number 7. If you watch this video, it will prime you and set you up to understand the rest of this lesson really well. In addition to this, if you really want to set yourself up really well, there's also the Amoeba sisters. So they've done a video on this as well. It's called Cellular Respiration and the Mighty Mitochondria. So I'd watch both of those and then go back to this lesson to hear what I'm going to be describing with these processes. So I pause the video now and have a watch of those two videos, then go back to this lesson. So hopefully you've watched those videos and at this point you've got a pretty good idea of what we're going to be looking at. And it's really just looking at how we take this glucose molecule, right, this 6-carbon molecule. And remember, we should start memorizing the chemical formula of glucose. So that's C6H12O6. Okay, it's a class carbohydrate because it's got 6 carbons to 12 hydrogens to 6 oxygens. So the ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen is 1 to 2 to 1. Right. So glucose is a monosaccharide. It's the monomer of the polysaccharide. It's the smallest subunit, and it's the one that the cell likes the most because it can make quite a bit of energy off of it. That's if there is oxygen present. Okay, so let's have a look at what actually happens to glucose. So glucose is a really big molecule. It cannot diffuse through the cell membrane on its own. It does require the help of proteins to help get the glucose across the membrane. Okay, so this is just going back to our cell membrane lesson. Okay, so it's really big molecule. It's not small and non-polar, so it won't diffuse easily by itself. It actually does require the help. So it's carrier mediated. Now, the type of energy that we talk about in the body is called ATP energy. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And again, scientists are very unoriginal when they name these molecules. Okay, so adenosine is the adenine, which is actually the nitrogenous base we looked at in nucleic acids. So if we actually eat nucleic acids, we can break them down into the nucleotides. We can actually reuse this in the body to make certain molecules like ATP. But that's for another lesson. So adenosine is the adenine and the sugar together. So that's the adenosine. Triphosphate is literally telling you there are 3 phosphate groups. Okay. So adenosine triphosphate made of an adenine nitrogenous base plus a sugar and 3 phosphate groups. Now the thing that's really important is the bonds between the phosphate groups, the phosphoanhydride bonds. These, you don't need to memorize the name of this, but you do need to know that these are very high energy bonds, okay? So ATP is what we call stored energy. We actually store lots of energy in these bonds. That means that when we break one of these bonds, like in this schematic right here, if we break this bond and we release a phosphate, we actually get the energy that was stored in that bond and we can use it to do whatever it is that we need to do. So that's why we constantly need to make sure we've got heaps of this stored energy. So if we need to do something with it, say like a muscle contraction, because Miss Dragon is trying to, contract her muscle to reach for a cup of coffee so she can take a drink, okay? We need to have this ATP on hand so that we can break that phosphate and get that energy in order to have my muscle contract, okay? So we need energy. We constantly need energy. Energy is released when that phosphate group is actually removed, okay? And the molecule that is left, because it only has 2 phosphates, we now call it adenosine diphosphate, okay? Adenosine diphosphate plus another phosphate becomes adenosine triphosphate, okay? All right, so there are 2 ways. So once glucose has actually gone into, so it's gotten the help of a protein to get through the cell membrane into the cell. So you're now on the intracellular side of the cell, okay, in the cytoplasm. It will undergo the first step of breaking it down in order to make energy. And that first step is what we call glycolysis. What's important to note is that glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, and glycolysis does not care whether we have oxygen or not, okay? So it doesn't have special conditions. It will always happen. So as long as glucose can cross the cell membrane, as long as it has no trouble getting across into the cell, glucose will always be broken down in glycolysis, in this process, into what's called pyruvate molecules, okay? This will always happen, okay? It's whether we have oxygen or not that will determine what happens to this pyruvate molecule, okay? But let's just have a closer look here. So this is my 1 glucose molecule, okay? Glucose will be broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules. So this big 6-carbon molecule gets broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules. So they're a lot smaller. And this process called glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. So this here is actually the membrane of the mitochondria, okay? And that's because the next 2 steps happen inside of the mitochondria. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, and it takes that big 6-carbon glucose molecule and breaks it down into 2 3-carbon molecules. In this process, it actually makes 2 ATP molecules. So already, just from breaking down this glucose molecule into 2 pyruvate, also called pyruvic acid. So each of these pyruvate is called pyruvic acid. So 2 pyruvic acid molecules or 2 pyruvate molecules, we actually make 2 ATP. Okay. However, in order to actually get the whole process started, we actually need to spend 2 ATP. So we need to already have ATP in the body. So we actually use 2 ATP. In total, we actually make 4 ATP molecules in glycolysis. But since we already used 2 of those, we say that the net gain in total is 2 ATP. So we've made 4 ATP in glycolysis, but we actually had to use 2 in order to make the 4. So 4 minus the 2, we've actually only made a profit of 2. So we have a net gain of 2 ATP through glycolysis. And that was breaking our 6-carbon glucose molecule into 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules or pyruvic acid molecules, okay? So we've made 2 ATP molecules. Now let's keep track of how many ATP molecules we make in each of these steps of cellular respiration. Okay, so glycolysis made 2 ATP. Now the thing is, in order for the remaining molecules to actually enter the mitochondria for the next 2 steps, it actually cannot go in as pyruvate. So we convert it in the cytoplasm, we convert it into something called acetyl coenzyme A, or we write it as acetyl-CoA. Okay, acetyl coenzyme A. So each of these pyruvate molecules gets converted into acetyl coenzyme A. Notice that we make a waste product called carbon dioxide. So cellular respiration, when we actually utilize glucose to make energy, we actually make this as a waste product, and this is what we breathe out. So we constantly have cellular respiration happening in our cells, and we're constantly making this waste product, which we have absolutely no use for, carbon dioxide. And so we actually take it to the lungs to actually remove later on. So we'll see how that happens a little bit later. Okay. So far we have glycolysis. So glucose enters the cell in the cytoplasm. This 6-carbon molecule, which we call glucose, gets broken into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate, and those get converted into acetyl coenzyme A, and we make carbon dioxide as a waste product. So now this acetyl coenzyme A molecule, so the 2 that we made, can actually enter the mitochondria to undergo the second step, or the second part of this process, and that's called the Krebs cycle. Sometimes we also call the Krebs cycle the citric acid cycle. They're the same, they're synonymous. So you can either call this the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. Okay, and it's called a cycle because it literally looks like a cycle. Okay, the important thing from this again is the acetyl coenzyme A enters this cycle, and each of these will undergo a cycle and in the process make an ATP molecule. So because we had 2 pyruvate molecules which got turned into acetyl coenzyme A, right? We had 2 acetyl coenzyme A from the 1 glucose. So each of those goes through. So even though we started with 1 glucose molecule, we ended up with 2 acetyl coenzyme A's, and each of those makes 1 ATP. So from the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, we make a net of 2 ATP molecules, right? A net of 2 ATP molecules, okay? This is showing us the exact same thing, okay? So in the cytoplasm, okay, once glucose has entered the cell, it's in the cytoplasm, that 6-carbon glucose molecule gets converted into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. Now, don't worry about this yet, because this is what happens if there's no oxygen. But as long as there's oxygen in the cell, as long as we're breathing okay, we're getting enough oxygen into our body, then pyruvate will get converted into acetyl coenzyme A. Okay, in that process, it makes an electron carrier. Now, you don't really have to understand this. Just note that it actually makes electron carriers. Okay. The acetyl coenzyme A can now enter the mitochondria and enter the Krebs cycle, okay? And in this process, it makes 2 ATP molecules, and notice it makes a whole heap of electron carriers, okay? Now, what's really important is all of these electron carriers that we've made in glycolysis and in the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, is what goes on to the the Krebs cycle happened in the mitochondrial matrix. So as soon as the acetyl coenzyme enters, this is the mitochondrial matrix right here, okay? The electron carriers actually enter the inner mitochondrial membrane. So that's this membrane right here on the inside. Because remember, the mitochondria is a double membraned organelle, okay? So the mitochondrial membrane, mitochondrial matrix is past the first outer membrane, okay? And the third step of this process, or the electron transport chain, is embedded in the inner membrane. And what it really requires is electrons from these electron carriers, okay? So this is again just a really complicated way of showing the exact same thing. So once glucose enters the cell, in the cytoplasm, we have glycolysis, which takes that glucose, that 6-carbon glucose, and turns it into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. So we get 2 pyruvate from 1 glucose, because there are 3 carbons. We had a 6 carbons, so we get 2 pyruvate. We make a net of 2 ATP from glycolysis, and that gets converted into acetyl coenzyme A, which enters the mitochondria in the mitochondrial matrix, okay? In the mitochondrial matrix, goes through a series of steps. You don't really need to know this. All you need to know is that we make an ATP molecule for each of the acetyl coenzyme A's, right? And we had 2 because we had 2 pyruvate. So we make an ATP molecule, we make carbon dioxide as a waste, and we make these electron carrier molecules. That will be important later, okay? So the first acetyl coenzyme A molecule goes through, makes an ATP molecule and all these electron carrier molecules in our waste product. And the second one goes through. This is all in the mitochondrial matrix, okay? And now these electron carriers are ready to be utilized in the next step, which is the electron transport chain, okay? So far we've made a net of 2 ATP in glycolysis in the cytoplasm, which turns glucose into pyruvate, okay? We've then made a net of 2 ATP in the mitochondrial matrix through the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, which takes the acetyl coenzyme A, okay, and makes a whole heap of electron carriers. And in the next step, we take all of those electron carriers that we made from the first 2 steps, and they enter what's called the electron transport chain, which is on the inner membrane, and they turn those into ATP. And the electron transport chain, which is on the inner mitochondrial membrane, is where we have majority of our ATP that's made. So from 1 glucose molecule, just 1 glucose, we can make upwards of 36 or even 38 ATP. So it really depends on the textbook you're looking at. Some textbooks will say 30 ATP, or some will say 36, some will say 32, some will say 38. So anywhere from 30 to 38 ATP molecules, ATP energy molecules, from 1 glucose molecule. Okay. So here's a learning check. So here's a little picture, right? So this is the mitochondria, okay? There's step 1, step 2, and step 3, okay? Which of the following correctly identifies the different processes? So A says number 1 is glycolysis, number 2 is the electron transport chain, 3 is the Krebs cycle. B says 1 is glycolysis, 2 is the Krebs cycle, 3 is the electron transport chain. C says number 1 is the Krebs cycle, number 2 is the electron transport chain, number 3 is glycolysis. And D says 1 is the electron transport chain, 2 is glycolysis, and 3 is Krebs cycle. Which do you think it is? So the process that turns glucose into pyruvic acid or pyruvate is glycolysis. So automatically we can narrow down our answers to A or B, okay? The second step, which is a cycle, okay, is the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, okay? So we can automatically cross out A. We know our answer choice is B. Okay, this third step here is the electron transport chain. This is again another way of representing everything we've just been talking about. So in the cytosol or the cytoplasm, glucose gets converted into pyruvate through a process called glycolysis. It's a series of steps. You don't really have to know the steps. You just have to know it's called glycolysis, okay? And we make a net of 2 ATP, okay? A net of 2 ATP. So, oh, sorry, this is not showing a net of 2 ATP. This is showing that we actually needed to use 2 ATP, right? In order to get this process going, we need to actually spend 2 ATP, okay? We make 4 ATP, okay, in total, but remember we spent 2, so our net from glycolysis is 2 ATP, okay? That pyruvic acid or pyruvate gets converted into acetyl coenzyme A, which then enters the mitochondria into the mitochondrial matrix, and enters the Krebs cycle, okay? When that happens, it actually makes a few electron carriers, okay? So this whole time we're making electron carriers, but that's not really important until we get to the last step. So in Krebs cycle, remember that each time one of these acetyl coenzyme A molecules undergoes a whole cycle, it makes an ATP molecule. So because we had 2 pyruvate, we had 2 acetyl coenzyme A molecules. Each of them underwent the Krebs cycle, so we ended up with 2 ATP molecules and a whole heap of these electron carriers. Now in the third step, okay, we take all of these electron carriers in the electron transport chain and we use them to make ATP, to make a net total of anywhere from 36 to 38 ATP molecules. This again is showing us the same thing, okay? So in the cytosol, glucose gets converted into pyruvate. That's through a process called glycolysis, okay? Here we have electron carriers, NADH, okay? That will go to the electron transport chain. When pyruvate gets converted into acetyl coenzyme A, there are more electron carriers that go into the electron transport chain. The acetyl coenzyme A will go through the Krebs cycle. That will make 2 more ATP, okay, and a whole heap of electron carriers, so NADH and FADH2, which go into the electron transport chain. So all of the electron carriers go into the electron transport chain and undergo the third process, which is called oxidative phosphorylation. Your book just refers to it as the electron transport chain, so I'm happy for you to know it as the electron transport chain. And this is where we take all of those electron carriers and we make ATP. This is where we make the most ATP, and this happens in the mitochondria. Okay? So what this actually looks like, and this is supposed to be a GIF, so when you actually open up the PowerPoint that I've uploaded, you'll see that the GIF actually working. I just have it as a PDF because it doesn't work on the laptop that I'm actually doing this recording on. But all of those electron carrier molecules will enter the electron transport chain right about here, okay? And they give off their electron. So if you take a negative away, so electrons are negatively charged. So if you take a negative away from a molecule, it becomes positive, okay? So the remainder of that molecule is positively charged. That doesn't matter. We just want the electron because the electron sets off a whole chain of processes, which at the very end, through the help of this enzyme called ATP synthase, and we'll talk about what enzymes are in the next lesson, will make ATP, okay? It'll also make water as a byproduct, okay? And that's just, again, a byproduct, okay? So we've made carbon dioxide in Krebs before as a byproduct. Water is made of as a byproduct. But the thing that we care about is this ATP energy. So each of those NADH molecules and each of those FADH2 have electrons that they give to the electron transport chain in order for this chain to actually make ATP. So we say when we're making something, we're synthesizing. So this is ATP synthesis, or this is how we make ATP, okay? So that's through the electron transport chain. Okay. You don't have to know very much about the electron transport chain other than it takes the electrons from these electron carriers to make ATP energy and water as a byproduct. Okay, so when we actually talk about cellular respiration, you'll see this written in your book, and you'll see this multiple times. This is what we call, this is how we write the chemical equation for the reaction of taking that glucose molecule, right, so C6H12O6 from glycolysis in the presence of oxygen, Okay, see how we actually use oxygen. Okay, in the presence of oxygen, and that's why it's called oxidative phosphorylations, because it uses oxygen to do this. If there was no oxygen, this entire chain would be at a standstill. So you can't use the electron transport chain when there's no oxygen. Okay, so that means that we actually can't make ATP using the electron transport chain when there's no oxygen. So how do we make ATP? And that's a great question, which we're going to look at in a second. Okay, but this is our chemical equation. So glucose, okay, and oxygen in the electron transport chain will actually, through a series of steps in this entire process, will make these byproducts: carbon dioxide, which we saw came out of Krebs cycle, right? Water, which we saw was made as a byproduct in the electron transport chain, and ATP energy. This is the chemical equation. Okay, so our reactants are the things that actually go into this process. These are the things that are made as a result. Okay, so if we actually look at where majority of the ATP energy is made, okay, majority of the energy, ATP energy, is made in the electron transport chain. It's in the inner mitochondrial membrane, inside the mitochondria. Now, this is in the presence of oxygen. So we saw that in order for the electron transport chain to continue to make these ATP molecules, it needs oxygen. If there is no oxygen, so let's say I'm doing an exercise and I've gone from jogging, where I'm breathing fine and I'm breathing in just as much oxygen as I need for the exercise that I'm doing. Okay, let's say for the last little bit of my run, I decide to go from jogging to a sprint because I just want to push myself in my workout. Okay, so I sprint. Now, for the first, a few seconds, I may still have enough oxygen to allow for the electron transport chain to continue to work and make ATP energy. But eventually, and you might be able to relate to this, you're sprinting and you're not breathing normally. You're actually almost hyperventilating. You're actually breathing quite difficult. Your breathing becomes quite difficult. It's more of like a and you're actually breathing out more than you're breathing in. So it means you're actually breathing out more carbon dioxide. Okay, you're breathing less and less oxygen to the point where you're actually breathing more carbon dioxide out than you are taking oxygen in. Okay, that's that panting that you hear, and that is actually what causes the standstill in the electron transport chain. Okay, now our muscles don't stop working. We still have our muscles working, so that means that we're getting ATP energy from somewhere else. It's not that we aren't making ATP at all. We still need to make ATP. But we're obviously not able to use the electron transport chain in order to do it. So how do we do it? Well, we do it through something called fermentation, okay? So this is that very first picture that I showed you, right? So if glucose enters the cell, it will always, whether there's oxygen or not, it will always be converted into pyruvate. So it doesn't matter. Glycolysis will always happen, okay? But if there's no oxygen, then I can't have that pyruvate turned into acetylcholine to undergo oxidative phosphorylation because there's no oxygen, okay? It can't undergo that. So what process can I take in order to still convert that pyruvate into energy? Well, it's not as efficient, but the body does have another mechanism. It'll undergo anaerobic respiration. So when I think of aerobic, I think of, aerobic exercise, usually like the really weird aerobic jazzercise classes from those funky looking aerobic classes from the 80s, okay? Aerobic, star jumps and whatnot, okay, is with oxygen. And that's what I think, okay? Anaerobic is without oxygen, okay? That's your sprinting, okay? That's like next level, okay? So in the presence or in the absence of oxygen, okay? In the absence of oxygen, if there's no oxygen, this doesn't work. So pyruvate actually undergoes anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration happens in the cytoplasm, so it has nothing to do with the mitochondria. Okay? The mitochondria is only with oxygen. As long as we have oxygen, we've got oxidative phosphorylation happening. We're making heaps of ATP. But when we don't have oxygen, we can't actually have that happen. The electron transport chain is a standstill. We can still make ATP, but we're just going to make it not as efficiently through another process called fermentation. And what happens here is we actually make something called lactic acid. So think of when you're sprinting, right? You get to a point in your sprint where you actually feel this like sharp pain in your muscles, okay? That's actually the buildup of an acid, okay? That acid is called lactate, okay? Or lactic acid. So the ending ate is the same as an acid, okay? It's just telling you acid. So for example, pyruvate, pyruvic acid, lactic acid, lactate, okay? So if we don't have oxygen, glucose will still undergo glycolysis and get turned into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. But that pyruvic acid, instead of undergoing the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, it'll stay in the cytoplasm and it'll undergo fermentation, which converts it into lactic acid. And that's what causes that pain that we feel when we're doing a very intense exercise like sprinting. Okay. Yeah. Is that all I have to say for that? So this is obviously, this occurs when we don't have oxygen, right? Now the thing is, okay, when we're done sprinting, what's the thing that happens normally, right? We'll probably get to our finish line. We'll stop sprinting right away because that pain is just unbearable, the pain from the lactic acid, right? Usually what happens is the person will hunch over, right? They'll put their palms right onto their thighs and they'll try to get back to their normal breathing rhythm, right? And get back to breathing normally. So what happens in the body is that lactic acid, okay, will go into the blood. The blood will take it all the way to the liver. And in the liver, once we start getting oxygen back into our body, in the liver, it'll combine with oxygen and it'll be converted into glucose. And in the liver, we can, put all of the glucose molecules together and we can store it as a big polysaccharide called glycogen. So glycogen is how we actually store glucose so that when we actually run out of energy, we can break down glycogen for the glucose so that we can respire it. Okay, so it can go through cellular respiration and we can make energy from it. Okay, that big molecule is called glycogen. We can have glycogen in the liver and in the muscles. So when we actually when we are undergoing anaerobic respiration, right, and we're making a whole heap of this lactic acid, which doesn't have the oxygen, okay, we're undergoing what's called an oxygen debt, okay? We need to wait for that oxygen in order to convert that lactic acid back into glucose so that we can store it and one day use it to break down to make energy again through cellular respiration. So in the meantime, we actually call it oxygen debt. Now, when we actually are hunched over and we start breathing normally and we actually start converting that lactic acid into glucose, we're repaying that debt. We call that oxygen recovery, okay? So that extra oxygen that we needed, okay, that's the recovery oxygen, and that's repaying our oxygen debt, which we had when we were undergoing anaerobic respiration. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to say really quickly was, now when we think about, the overall chemical reaction of cellular respiration, which is, and this is aerobic respiration, aerobic because it needs oxygen, okay? This is what we say. One glucose molecule needs 6 oxygen gas molecules in order to make 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 molecules of water. These are just byproducts, and majority of our body is water, so that makes sense. This we end up breathing out. The ATP is the energy that we store, so we have heaps of it. So all of the stored phosphate anhydride bonds all over the body, so that we can, if we need to, break the phosphate off to release that energy to do something like a muscle contraction. So we've got heaps of that ATP energy. The thing that I haven't written in here is that's not the only type of energy that's made in cellular respiration. In fact, most of the energy that we actually make is not ATP energy. Only 40% of the energy that we make through cellular respiration is ATP energy. Most of it is actually heat energy. And that makes sense, right? If you think about it. So let's say right now in Albany, it's actually pretty chilly outside. I'd say it's probably about 15 degrees Celsius. My body core temperature is actually 37 degrees Celsius, about, right? So if I step outside, my body core temperature is still going to be 37 degrees Celsius. Why is it that the inside of my body is actually hotter than the surrounds that I'm in? Okay? The reason is each of my cells is undergoing cellular respiration. Each of my cells is eating or breaking down, metabolizing sugar, glucose, using oxygen to do that, into carbon dioxide, which I breathe out, into water, which helps to make up the cytoplasm and, the plasma of my blood and basically majority of my body, okay? And releasing heat. All of my cells are constantly undergoing cellular respiration and making heat. And that's the reason why my body core temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. It's because we're constantly undergoing cellular respiration. We're constantly making heat energy, which keeps our body core temperature upwards around 36, 37 degrees Celsius, even when, the room temperature is closer to 20 or 22. Okay? That other stored energy we make in order to do all of the things that we need to do. And the best example is muscular contractions. But we'll look at that when we actually start looking at muscles and how muscles work and how muscular contractions work, or muscle movement. Okay? So hopefully that's helped you guys to look at what happens to the food that we eat, the fact that we break down all of the foods into these big biological macromolecules, right? We've got 4 different types that we find in the body. So we'll break them down into proteins, we'll break them down into nucleic acids, into lipids, into carbohydrates, and we'll break them down from their big polymer units into smaller subunits, which we call monomers. And the most important that we care about in the body is our class carbohydrates and the monosaccharide glucose. And we looked at how cells take glucose and, when we're breathing okay, when we've got oxygen present, how it actually breaks it down and makes heaps of these ATP molecules, which is stored chemical energy for our body so that we can do all of the things that we need to do. Or, if, for whatever reason, we don't actually have the oxygen present, so I'm sprinting, I'm doing something where I'm actually not taking in as much oxygen as my body actually requires, then we undergo something called anaerobic respiration. That glucose still gets broken down, but it undergoes a different mechanism and makes less ATP molecules. Okay, but it's how we go from the food that we eat into making energy that our body uses. And that is the essence of metabolism.